Everybody, welcome to this episode. Another little castle, and I'll just introduce myself. Adam, I'm the head gardener, and we're being filmed by Paul, our social media marketing manager. So each week we're trying to bring you into the gardens and give you a little taste of what's going on, the growth, what's in flower, what's looking good, and hopefully show you there's so much associated with the castle, as you know, primarily, but there's 70 acres of gardens and grounds and several hundred acres of paths and walkways throughout the estate, and we're just trying to give you a little taste of that, really. So today I'm starting off down in the lower rock close in what is a wilder area, and I'm going to bring you up into our Pinetum in the upper rock close and then finish in the fairy glade. So as has become customary, we'll get the map out and I can show you where we are. So here's the main square in Blarney and the main entrance, and we're right on the far left hand side. We've come up the boardwalks here on the lower rock close from the Seven Sisters, and we're standing here at the end of the boardwalk. We're going to head up into the rock close in the upper areas, the Pinetum, and then finish over here in the fairy glade. But before we do that, I wanted just to talk a little bit about the area that's surrounding us here. Green and lush and rather overgrown looking to a certain extent, and that's because these are the wild parts of the gardens, and it's lovely to think that the average visitor within 10 minutes stroll of the main entrance can find themselves alone in the woods like this, and it's a way to really bring nature to the visitor. Now, I like to think a lot of the tourists that visit Blarney traditionally have come in on tour buses or have travelled all over the country, maybe even all over Europe, hopping on and off these buses and queuing up and going into these places, and haven't actually really seen anything off the beaten track. So even if we just get a small percentage lost in the woods for a few minutes, I think it's added value in its own right. But see a little bit of Wild Island. So we introduced these boardwalks in the last few years, and what is quite a boggy, overgrown area, and that's our only real. Other than that, we've left all the native flora come through. We've pruned out a few and taken out a few unwanteds, let's say, and we've encouraged the waterways. We've opened up the pond, which was, we think, an old pond area, and old drainage ditches that had been silted up, and we've cleaned them out, and it's now an absolute haven for wildlife. It's full of frogs, and I've seen otters down here, kingfishers, so it really is a wonderful space. And if you listen while we're walking up towards the Pinetum, you'll hear a lot of the bird song, and I'm not going to talk because it's experienced. To the right, you'll see one of, and again, this is very much a wilderness now, and it's not a more frequented area of the estate. It's a quieter corner, and the wildlife obviously. As we go up, there's all the native wild, the wild garlic. So these are all native. This is the aspleniums, the hart's tongue ferns they call them, and then we've our other Dryopteris species, again native species, the wild garlic. I love the way the sunlight comes through the new growth on the trees here and just catches everything. So we're now entering up into the upper rock close and into our Pinetum. Now the Pinetum, it's kind of been a three-stage development, because we suspect in the 1900s, when a lot of the North American conifer species were arriving in the country and being planted out as specimens, some of, I suppose, the leftovers got kind of stuck into this corner of the field of the estate gardens and left. And they grew away quietly, you know, really undisturbed, and they formed the backbone. Then nothing was done until really the 1970s, when our friend Harold Hillier, who has Hillier's Nurseries in the UK, became involved in the development of the gardens, and he suggested this area as an ideal spot for developing a Pinetum. I should explain, a Pinetum is a collection of coniferous plants, so all the pine and the conifer species in one location, if you like. And so they put in quite a few rare and unusual species at this point, and then again it was about. And a few years, I suppose we're talking around 10 years ago, Sir Charles and myself had a conversation, and I said, great to develop a Pinetum, and he said, well, we technically already have one and it might need a bit of work. So we came in, and 37 semi-mature sycamore trees had to be removed, which had grown up in the meantime and created what was an impenetrable jungle. And we then created the paths, saved the trees that were already present, gave them some breathing space, took out a few dead and diseased, and started to plant. Most of the wood that came out of here was used to create furniture, which is actually in our cafe, so if you're ever in for a coffee, have a look. But we then started the collection, and we now have over 300 varieties of conifers in here, some of them extremely rare in Ireland. So as we go through, I'll point out a few, but before we do that, I want to show you one of our more historical features. There's an outcrop of rock further up here in which somebody's built a fireplace, and traditionally it's been called the Sentry Post, and we suspect that we know two on the estate, which are kind of covered areas of shelter where the soldiers would have been put on duty in effect to look over the outlying lands of the estate and keep watch for invaders. So this was a very overgrown area, and as we were clearing we came across what's a clearly man-made structure. And I'll jump in and try not to squash too much garlic. But you can very clearly see the fireplace and the chimney. And I'd hate to try and date it, but it would be great to think that this was, you know, an area the soldiers would have had the fire going to, well, to warm themselves and feed themselves while on duty, watching over the lands. And at this stage they'd have probably had a full clearance, and you see the way the land drops here, it would have provided an ideal vantage point to spot any potential invaders moving up towards them. So lots of hidden history in Blarney, and do come across something that's maybe while I'm passing, this is a South American species, Podocarpus Seligman, the willow leaf podocarp, and we've quite a few of these through this area. That some of them date to Harold Hillier's time, but a lot of them have been planted in the last 10 years. And Paul, a few larger ones, and the parents of these are actually growing in Fota grounds and gardens, and friend stam bamboo he cutting had been pots. It got to the stage where he had these carpet. He had doing the Pinetum. So he said, you know, he'd love them to go to a good home where they could be kept together as a group. So we made a deal, and a large group of them got planted into here. And normally you'd see a Podocarpus, because they're quite rare, as a single specimen. So to see a large group of them planted together, it is quite unusual, and luckily we have the space to do it. These went in about 7 years ago as, I suppose, about 6-foot specimens, and they're very happy. Look at them. One of the other things we did when we started clearing this impenetrable woodland was that we actually had an amazing bluebell areas already established, and none of this was introduced. We just left nature to it, and this is what's developed. Now the rock close we try to leave reasonably wild. I think the spirit of the place and the sense of it is that you explore, you push through these slightly overgrown paths, and you try to see what's around the next corner. It lends itself very well to this romantic idea of discovery, and all of our new planting is trying to reflect that. So we want these areas to establish and close in and become a little bit overgrown. And while I'm here, that is the tallest tree on our estate. It's a 45-metre Sitka spruce, Picea sitchensis, and you can actually see it from the road coming in from Cork. It's standing alone like a flagpole almost, just letting you know that it's there. There's a monkey puzzle here I just want to show you as well, just out of interest. Not everybody will necessarily be familiar. Araucaria auricana, and you can see why they call it the monkey puzzle, because you try climbing up one of these. Very hard, very spiky, but again endangered in its natural habitat. Chilean again. Now when we were clearing, there was a lot of overgrown area of ivy, briars, rhododendron ponticum, which is obviously an unwanted invader, and this outcrop of rock you see in front of you, when we were starting to tidy up, we thought this was an old dumping site or something. We brought the diggers in and we said we want to just tidy this up, and we put the first bucket down, it went clunk, and we realised that it was actually this wonderful outcrop of limestone. Now Blarney's on limestone, and as a result of that, we have this amazing landforms, I suppose, that appear just randomly out of the ground and give us these opportunities for developing and planting. So in effect, we have our own natural rock garden, and I decided the best way to show it off was to create a garden for smaller conifer species, so the dwarf conifers, and plant the larger species in the open ground around it. So in effect, we've got a large open area of large conifer species, and then as we come closer into the middle, we'll have this clearing of smaller species, and you'll kind of discover it again. This is one worth pointing out. This is a Pinus Montezumae Sheffield Park selection, and you see it's very, very blue looking. Kind of changes colour a little over the course of the summer depending on the weather. But at the moment it's looking glorious, and you see all the new growth. Now, a lot of people believe that you should prune and train pine trees to encourage them up into a certain shape, let's say, and I had a conversation with somebody giving a tour one day where they were horrified that we hadn't pruned this tree and were trying to stake it and train it, and I said, well, it's trying to do this, so let's let it have a go. Let's let it find its own form. That's what would happen in the wild. And they went off in a bit of a huff because they didn't appreciate my opinion, and another lovely lady that was on the tour pulled me to one side and said, I thoroughly agree with you, but I can't say anything because that's my husband. And so I'm of the opinion that it was the right decision, and it's forming its own space and its own shape. But you'll see the outcrop of rocks, again the limestone, just you can see how this inspired the idea of druids and witches and wizards with all these little wonderful outcrops. And as the larger trees develop around us, this will become a little oasis. Most of the conifers are labelled in here because I feel it's important in a collection such as this, and we're trying to get the labels on all the trees. But just as an example, this is what J is tucked away. So Pinus parviflora and the variety Jacuza goten. That's our reference number, family and country of origin. This is a Japanese one. And it is in fact a tree from prehistoric times, only discovered in 1994. Until then, this tree was only known from the fossil records. And a man out hiking in a national park in Australia, just outside of Sydney, came across an unusual tree that he'd never seen before. And he brought a cutting of it back to a friend of his for identification. They couldn't identify it. And lo and behold, completely new species. And they found that there's only around 30 individuals of these left in the wild. And so they started a micropropagation project to grow them on and distribute them. And they're now readily available in the trade. But by doing that, they know sorts of different locations and environments because they can be tested. They're not so, let's say, precious. If there were only 30 of the things in existence, we couldn't be sending them out all over the world and trying planting them here and there and seeing. So by doing this micropropagation, we're able to distribute large numbers fast and get them back out there. And we were able to try them and say, yes, they can actually go down to -14 and survive, but they do not like exposure to cold winds. We found that by the areas, different places we planted them in. And it's always good to trial these things and learn a lot about them. And as a botanic garden, this is one of the things that we do, and we share information with other botanic gardens around the world and learn from each other. So this is a very exciting tree, but it's become quite common. I'm now going to show you another one which is less common. I've my Vietnamese, and one of the Vietnamese conifer species that's highly endangered is the Vietnamese golden cypress, Vietnamese. Only a handful of individuals growing one ridge on one mountain, and cuttings of this plant had been taken and been grown, but until very recently they'd only ever been grown from cuttings. And these are we planted a trio because when we put them in they were only tiny things, so this is almost a nursery bed. I plan to move 2 of them next autumn. But last year I actually visited the site where these were up a nursery. Fabulous. They've slope lower down. We climbed up to this ridge, limestone karst ridge, so a little bit dangerous, but very interesting. At the top of the ridge, we found these conifers that had a send, and our guy, he knew the route which is easier. So I mean, we pay the and behold, 2 hours skirting the stone ridge and all it with juvenile, everything growing away happily, but in a remote, inaccessible location. And we discovered the reason that they're still there was because we'd actually got lost on the mountain. We had to turn around, trace our footsteps, come down the path in the dark using head torches, and that's not something to repeat, but I would for the world. We're the only people to ever see the local population, so experience. maybe out here, think about the way them there. They are quite because it's at the moment coming up. I'm talking really the road and fairy doors and car rooms for the children to find, and this is an area very much for the kids to kind of explore and see what they can come across. And so I want to bring you in now. 2010 in London, we had a lot of South Australia and Southern Hemisphere species in this area, and they were killed, so big clearance, put in quite a lot of new planting, but everything's doing well and fill in now, and you see there are specs in the look at the light coming through the main with it. It's bright. Lots to find in here. An example with a little fairy door and a little toadstool, and people like to leave gifts, be it money, shells, or sometimes sweets. I suppose everybody has their own idea what the fairy's like, but I just try to give you a little taste of the space and the area that we're in, and I hope you've enjoyed that, and I hope you'll join us again next week for another little tour. But that's it for this week. We will hopefully be opening the gardens on Monday for locals, and for any locals that are watching, I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you in here, because it'll be great to see some familiar faces that we maybe haven't come across for a while. So thanks very much.